Tom was an elderly cowboy who had spent many years riding across wide fields and quiet valleys, and although his hands had grown weak and his back had stiffened with age, he still carried the calm strength of someone who had lived close to the land for a long time. His small ranch had once been full of life, with the sound of cattle moving and the smell of fresh hay rising in the warm air, but now the fences were worn, the barns were fading, and his children had long since drifted away to chase busy lives in faraway towns. They called him only once in a while, and the calls lasted only a moment, and each time they spoke, Tom felt the strange distance in their voices, as if they no longer understood who he was or what this land had meant to their family. One cold morning Tom found a letter waiting for him on the old wooden table near the window, and the moment he opened it, something heavy settled inside his chest. The letter was written by his eldest son, who explained that the family had decided to sell the ranch, and they believed Tom should move into a small room in a town care center where others could look after him. Tom stood still as he read the message again, and he felt the ranch around him fall silent. The walls seemed to breathe with him as if sharing the hurt he carried. He did not argue in his mind, and he did not think of calling anyone. He simply understood that the children he had raised with patience and love had stepped away from him, and that the life he had built here was no longer his to claim. Tom packed only a few belongings, carrying nothing more than what he truly needed: a blanket, a kettle, a rope, a small knife, and some clothes. He saddled his horse, a calm old mare named River, and with a long steady breath he turned away from the home that had shaped him for 4 decades. He left without anger, because anger never grew in his heart, but he left with a quiet ache that spread across his ribs as he rode toward the tall cliffs on the far side of the valley. Years ago he had camped on those cliffs for a few days during a cattle drive, and he remembered the peaceful wind that whispered across the stone. So he chose that place now, a place far from judgment and far from the noise of the world. The journey took most of the day as he guided River up narrow paths and around sharp turns, and when he finally reached the ridge, the view opened before him like a grand painting created by the sky itself. The valley stretched far below, filled with soft green slopes and winding streams that glowed in the fading light. Tom felt a strange calm wash over him as he stepped down from the saddle, and for the first time in a long while, he felt like the land was listening to him again. Here on this cliff he felt no pressure, no voices telling him where to go, no weight from those who had forgotten his efforts. Here he could begin again. Tom placed his blanket on a flat rock and lit a small fire using dry branches he found nearby. The flames rose gently, warming his hands and face as the night settled around him. The sky above the cliff was wide and clear, with stars shining like tiny lamps, and Tom leaned back, watching the sky move without hurry. He remembered nights like this from his younger days when he would rest beside a campfire after long rides across the open plains, and those memories softened the ache he carried. As he sat near the fire, he thought about the ranch, about how many years he had worked to keep it alive, repairing fences, guiding cattle, waking before sunrise to feed the animals, and returning at night exhausted but satisfied. He thought about how he had hoped his children would one day understand the value of simple living and the strength that came from staying close to the land, but life had moved differently for them, and Tom no longer blamed them. He simply felt the truth settle inside him, like a quiet wind. When he finally lay down on the blanket, he listened to the soft sound of the breeze moving across the cliff edge. He felt the night air brush gently across his skin, and he closed his eyes with a calm he had not felt in years. He was alone, but not lonely, because the land around him felt alive and welcoming. The cliff did not judge him. It did not push him away. It only offered space and silence. Tom breathed slowly, and decided he would stay here. He would live on this cliff and build a place of his own with his own hands and his own sense of purpose. This was not the end of his story. This was the beginning of a new one. And under the quiet sky, with River resting nearby and the fire glowing low, Tom drifted into sleep with a steady heart, ready for whatever the next morning would bring. Tom woke before the sun rose above the line of the cliffs, and for a moment he lay still on his blanket, listening to the soft hum of the early wind as it moved over the rocks and through the dry grass around him. The sky was slowly turning pale, and the morning air felt cool against his skin, and he felt a sense of purpose inside his chest, as if the land itself was encouraging him to stand and begin the work he had promised himself. He pushed himself up carefully because age had made his joints slow and tight, but he did not mind the stiffness because it reminded him that he was still alive and still able to shape his own life in his own way. River lifted her head from where she had rested, and Tom gently brushed the mare's neck as he whispered a calm greeting to her, and the horse blinked at him with quiet trust that warmed his heart. Tom walked along the ridge searching for a good place to begin building a proper shelter because although sleeping under the sky had been peaceful he knew he needed walls and a roof before the weather grew harsh. After exploring the cliffside for a while, he found a natural curve in the rock that felt sheltered from the wind, and the position allowed him to look over the valley below without fear of strong gusts pulling him off balance. He touched the rock with his hand and felt the warmth of the sun slowly rising behind him, and something about this spot felt right in a way he could not explain, so he decided this would be the foundation of his new home. He began gathering stones from around the ridge, picking each one carefully to make sure it would fit well with others. His hands trembled slightly from age, but his movements were steady because he had spent a lifetime working with tools and shaping fences and guiding ropes, and even now his instincts remained strong. He stacked the stones in a half circle to form the first outline of a wall, and even though the wall rose only to his knees he felt proud of it, because it represented the first step toward a future he was building on his own terms. As he worked, he hummed an old tune he remembered from his younger days when he would ride long journeys with other cowboys across the open plains. The sun climbed higher, and the heat across the stone increased, but Tom continued working at a slow and patient pace. He stopped only to drink water, and let River rest in a shaded area nearby. Each time he looked at the growing wall, he felt a steady satisfaction rise inside him because he knew that even if the world had pushed him aside, he still had the strength to create something meaningful with his own hands. He never rushed because he believed that building with care was the same as building with respect. And respect was something the land always gave back when it was offered sincerely. By midday the short wall reached his waist and he stood back to admire it. The stones were not perfect and the edges were uneven, but the structure was strong and he could feel the stability in each layer he had placed. He leaned against the wall and let the breeze cool his face, and in that moment he felt more at home than he had felt in years because this wall belonged to him alone and no one could take it away. He ate a small meal of dried food and let his body rest before returning to the task. As he worked through the afternoon, he began to think about his past, about the long rides under summer skies, about the laughter of his children when they were young, about the countless sunrises he had watched from the ranch porch. These thoughts did not bring sadness, but rather gave him strength because he knew everything he had lived had shaped him into the person who now stood on this cliff determined to rebuild. For many years he had been surrounded by work and responsibility, but now he had nothing to distract him from the simple act of living. Every stone he lifted reminded him that he was still capable of shaping his own story. By the time the sun dipped low behind the distant hills, the wall had reached a stable height, and Tom felt a wave of tired pride settle over him. He stretched his back slowly, feeling the familiar ache, but the ache felt honest and earned. He looked over the edge of the cliff and watched the valley turn gold in the fading light. The view felt like a reward the land was giving him for his effort, and he accepted it with quiet gratitude. As the wind grew cooler, Tom gathered a few branches to prepare a small fire. He lit it with care and sat beside it, letting the warmth settle across his hands. Nearby River grazed lightly on the patches of dry grass, and occasionally lifted her head to look at him, as if checking that he was all right. Tom smiled at the horse because her steady presence had been his only companion through many difficult moments, and now she was sharing this new beginning with him. As night arrived, Tom sat beside the half-built wall and listened to the calm silence that covered the cliff. The stars appeared one by one, and the glow of the fire flickered gently against the stones. He wrapped himself in his blanket and leaned back against the wall, feeling protected by the shelter he had begun to create. He thought about the ranch he had left behind, and although the memory still held weight, he no longer felt the sharp sting of loss. Instead, he felt a sense of direction, a quiet confidence that he was exactly where he needed to be. He watched the sky for a long time, letting the quiet deepen around him. The cliff felt peaceful and strong, and he sensed that the land accepted him without question. In the gentle night air, he whispered a small promise to himself that he would continue building, continue shaping this space into a true home. He wanted to create something that reflected his resilience, something that would stand strong even when no one else stood with him. This thought filled him with a calm determination. Before closing his eyes, he looked at the unfinished wall and imagined what it would become. He saw a roof made of wood beams, a door shaped from fallen timber, a place where he could rest safely through harsh nights and stormy days. He pictured a space where he could wake each morning with purpose and fall asleep each night with peace. This dream gave him strength, and he breathed slowly, feeling the weight of the day settle into his bones. Tom lay down near the fire and pulled the blanket closer. The night air was cool but gentle, and he felt safe within the circle of stones he had built. He listened to the distant rustle of wind sweeping across the valley and the soft breathing of River nearby. With these sounds guiding him, he closed his eyes and drifted into slow sleep. The cliff had given him a place to start again, and he accepted it with a thankful heart. Tom woke with the early light touching the cliffside, and for a moment, he lay quietly listening to the wind as it brushed across the stones around him. His body felt tired from the work of the previous days, but it was a good kind of tiredness. The kind that came from building something honest with his own hands. And when he sat up, he felt a steady confidence rising inside him. River lifted her head from the ground, and flicked her ears toward him, and Tom smiled warmly at the mare because her presence always made the mornings feel less lonely. After brushing the dust from his clothes, Tom walked to the half-built wall and placed his hand on the stones he had stacked the day before. The wall felt solid under his fingers, and he felt a quiet pride fill his chest because this simple structure reminded him that even at his age he could still create something meaningful. He stood for a long moment imagining what the next step should be, and after thinking it through he decided he would build a wooden roof frame today and start shaping a proper doorway. Tom walked along the cliffside searching for long branches that had fallen from the trees growing further down the slope. He climbed slowly and carefully because the rocks were uneven and he did not want to risk slipping. But his determination pushed him forward. By midday he had gathered a pile of thick branches and long pieces of wood that he believed could serve as support beams. He tied them together with rope and dragged them across the rocky ground back to the construction site. Once he reached his chosen spot, he began shaping the wood, trimming the ends with his knife and smoothing rough edges with steady movements. His hands were old, but they remembered how to handle tools, how to carve, how to judge the strength of wood, and he worked with a calm rhythm that felt almost familiar, like returning to a skill he had never truly forgotten. He lifted the first beam and placed it across the top of the stone wall, using smaller sticks to balance the weight until he secured the beam with rope. Then he added a second beam, then a third, creating a frame strong enough to support a roof made of bark and branches. As he worked, the sun moved across the sky and shadows shifted on the ground, and Tom paused only to drink water or rest for a moment in the cool shade beside River. He spoke softly to the mare while resting, and sometimes he hummed a tune from his younger days. In these moments, he felt a sense of peace that he had not felt in many years, as if time itself had slowed down to keep him company. With the frame nearly complete, Tom began collecting large pieces of bark from fallen logs below the ridge. He climbed carefully and carried the bark back in several trips. Each piece he lifted felt heavy but manageable, and he reminded himself that patience was his strongest tool. He laid the bark across the beams and filled the gaps with smaller branches and dry grass, creating a thick layer that he hoped would protect him from rain and strong wind. By the time the sun dipped toward the far edge of the valley, his roof was almost finished. It was not perfect, and the lines were not straight, but the structure felt strong and dependable. Tom stood inside the half-built shelter and looked around slowly, feeling a warm sense of belonging wrap around him. This space was his, and he had shaped it with steady hands and calm effort, and no one could take that away from him. As evening settled in, Tom began gathering more stones for the next part of his project, which was building a small fireplace inside the shelter. He believed that having a fire indoors would make nights warmer and safer once colder weather arrived. He stacked the stones in a small circle and left enough space for air to move through, then checked the alignment by placing a small dry branch inside. He knew he would finish the fireplace later, but even seeing the early shape made him feel encouraged. While he worked, he heard the sound of distant birds returning to their nests and the gentle rustle of wind moving down the valley. These sounds reminded him of his old ranch, and for a moment he felt a soft ache inside his heart. He remembered mornings when his children were young and would run barefoot across the yard chasing each other while he prepared the horses. He remembered nights by the fireplace when they would gather around him to hear stories of old cattle drives and long journeys across the plains. Those memories felt warm, but they no longer hurt him the way they once had because now he had found a place where he could breathe again without feeling abandoned. When darkness settled across the land, Tom lit a small fire outside the shelter and sat with his back against the new wall. The flames danced gently, and the warm glow spread across the stones, and his tired face. River lay nearby, her head resting on her legs, and the calm rhythm of her breathing brought comfort to Tom. He ate a simple meal and looked at the quiet sky sprinkled with stars, feeling grateful that the land had given him a place to start over. After finishing his meal, he walked back inside his half-built cabin and looked around once more. The light from the fire outside flickered gently against the wooden beams, creating soft shadows that moved across the stone floor. He imagined how the place would look once it was complete, with a door shaped by his own hands and shelves carved from wood to store food and supplies. He imagined waking up each morning inside a home he had built himself and stepping outside to watch the sun rise over the valley. This dream filled him with strength, and he whispered a quiet promise to continue building until the home felt complete. He lay down near the entrance of the shelter with his blanket wrapped around him, and the warmth of the fire reaching him from outside the ground felt rough but comforting because it reminded him that he was connected to the land in a way he had not been for a long time. He listened to the night wind glide across the cliff edge, and he allowed the sound to guide him into rest. In that peaceful moment, he knew he was no longer running from the past. He was moving toward a new future, and every stone and every piece of wood he placed was helping him shape that future. And with that thought, Tom closed his eyes and drifted into sleep with calm in his heart and purpose in his mind, because tomorrow he would continue building, and the cliff would watch over him just as it always did. Tom woke as the morning sun slowly touched the new roof above his head, and for a moment he stayed still, listening to the soft stir of wind moving through the wooden beams above him. He felt stronger than he had in weeks, and his heart carried a steady sense of hope, because each day on the cliff was giving him a new reason to keep building. When he stepped outside the shelter, he stretched his arms and breathed deeply while looking across the wide valley where pale light spread like a soft blanket over the land. River stood near the edge of the ridge, grazing quietly, and lifted her head when she noticed Tom walking toward her. Tom brushed her mane with gentle hands and spoke to her in a low, calm voice, telling her they had a long day of work ahead, yet he felt ready for it. He had decided that today he would build a proper doorway and finish securing the wooden frame so the shelter would feel more like a real home. Tom walked along the ridge to find a large fallen tree he had spotted the day before, and he began cutting it into planks with slow, steady motions. His arms ached from the effort, but he did not stop because he knew that building this door was an important step in turning the shelter into something safe and complete. He imagined how good it would feel to close a door he had shaped himself and rest inside as the wind moved harmlessly outside. As he carved the wood, he remembered how he once helped his neighbors build barns and fences during the early years of the ranch. He remembered the laughter of those long days when the work was hard, but the company made everything lighter. Those memories filled him with warmth and encouraged him to continue shaping the wood even though his hands shook from time to time. When he finally carried the shaped planks back to the shelter, he began fitting them together using rope strips to hold them firm. He worked with patience, adjusting each piece until the door stood strong, and even once it was ready, he lifted it and set it between the stone walls of the shelter, pushing it gently until it settled into place. He tested it by pulling it open and closing it slowly, and he felt a wave of satisfaction sweep over him because the door was strong despite being handmade. The sound of hoofbeats echoed across the ridge, and Tom looked up to see a rider approaching. For a moment, he thought it might be a traveler passing through, but as the horse drew closer, he realized it was a young man with a familiar face. It was Mark, the rider who had visited him once before when he had become lost near the ridge. Mark waved, and Tom lifted a hand in greeting, glad to see a friendly face. Mark dismounted and looked at the shelter with wide eyes full of surprise and admiration. He told Tom that he had wondered how the building had been coming along, and that curiosity had brought him back. Tom invited him to sit on a flat rock near the cabin, and offered water from his wooden cup. Mark accepted with gratitude, and the two sat quietly for a moment, enjoying the peaceful breeze. Mark asked how Tom had gathered so much wood and stone on his own, and Tom explained the slow, steady work he had done over the past days. Mark listened with respect and nodded often as if trying to understand every detail. After a while, Mark reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small pack containing nails, a hammer, dried food, and a few strong rope pieces. He placed the pack in front of Tom and said these were small things he hoped would help. Tom looked at the items and felt a gentle warmth spread inside his chest. He thanked Mark with sincere words because gifts given with kindness were rare, and he appreciated the effort deeply. Mark smiled and said he wanted to help not out of pity but out of respect because he admired Tom's courage and strength. Tom accepted this explanation and felt grateful to hear sincerity in Mark's voice. After resting for a while, Mark helped Tom secure the door more firmly using the nails and hammer he had brought together. They worked in a quiet rhythm, and the sound of hammer strikes echoed across the cliff like steady heartbeats. When they finished, the doorway felt stronger, and the entire shelter looked more complete than before. Tom stepped back and admired the cabin as Mark stood beside him, smiling proudly. They talked for a long while about the land, about life, and about how quiet moments like these had become rare in the world. Tom told Mark a few stories from his ranch days about long rides, open skies, and lessons he had learned from nature. Mark listened closely, absorbing every detail with interest. In return, Mark spoke about his own struggles and dreams, and Tom listened with patience and understanding. When the sun began to lower, Mark prepared to leave. Before mounting his horse, he told Tom he would return soon to bring more tools, and maybe even help with building a small lookout platform or storage shed. Tom thanked him again, and this time the gratitude felt deeper because for many years he had believed he would spend the rest of his life without anyone choosing to stand beside him. As Mark rode away, Tom watched him disappear along the winding path, and he felt a sense of connection he had not felt in a long time. After Mark left, Tom returned to his shelter and looked at the door they had worked on together. He pressed his hand against it and felt the strength in every plank and rope piece. It reminded him that life still had room for new friendships and that he was not as alone as he once believed. He spent the rest of the evening fixing the roof edges and checking the stone walls to make sure they were secure. River stayed close to him, and the soft sound of her breathing as she grazed made the evening feel peaceful. Tom ate a simple meal and sat at the edge of the ridge watching the sun sink behind the distant hills, turning the sky into shades of orange and gold. He thought about how far he had come since leaving the ranch, and he felt stronger and more certain of his place in the world. The cliff had become more than a refuge, it had become a place where he could grow again and rediscover parts of himself he thought had faded forever. When night settled across the land, he stepped inside his shelter and closed the new door. The sound of the wood clicking into place filled him with calm. He lay down on his blanket and listened to the quiet around him. The shelter felt warm and steady, and Tom knew he had built something that would protect him. As he drifted into sleep, he felt grateful for the land, for River, and for the unexpected kindness of Mark. The cliff no longer felt lonely, it felt alive, and Tom felt at peace in a way he had not felt for many years. Tom woke to the soft warmth of morning sunlight spilling through the cracks between the wooden beams of his shelter, and he lay still for a moment listening to the gentle hum of wind outside. The air felt calm, and the sky looked clear through the small gaps in the roof, and he felt rested in a way he had not felt in many years. When he stepped outside and looked across the wide valley below, he felt the kind of peace that came only from steady work and honest living. His cabin stood strong behind him with its stone walls and wooden roof and well-fitted door, and he felt a quiet pride rise inside his chest as he walked around it, checking the corners and beams. River stood near the edge of the ridge, grazing lightly as she did every morning, and she lifted her head when Tom approached, then walked closer to him with gentle steps. Tom brushed her neck and whispered a calm greeting because she had been his companion through every part of this journey, and he felt grateful for her company. Today Tom planned to add a lookout platform beside the cabin because he believed it would help him see storms approaching, and also give him a peaceful place to watch the sunrise and sunset. He gathered long beams of fallen wood he had collected earlier in the week, and began shaping them carefully using his knife and rope. His hands were slow but steady, and he worked with patience because he had learned that time was his ally and not his enemy. He carried the beams to the flat rock area beside the cabin and tied them together, creating a simple frame. He lifted shorter pieces of wood and placed them across the top until the platform grew strong enough to support his weight. As he worked, he listened to the sound of distant birds and the low rustle of wind moving across the valley, and these sounds made the morning feel calm and alive. While he was tying the last beam into place, he heard the faint echo of hoofbeats approaching from the trail below the ridge. He turned and saw Mark riding toward him with a wide smile across his face. Tom felt a warm comfort fill his chest because Mark had become a friend he could rely on, and he appreciated the young man's steady presence. Mark dismounted near the cabin and looked around with awe because the shelter looked stronger and more impressive than the last time he had visited. He walked over to Tom and shook his hand, then said he had brought more supplies and wanted to help with whatever Tom planned to build next. Tom nodded with gratitude and invited him to see the nearly finished platform. Together they climbed onto the wooden frame, and Mark praised its structure, calling it clever and sturdy. They worked side by side for a while, adding support beams and tightening rope strips until the lookout stood firm. When they finished, they stepped up onto the platform together and looked out across the valley. From that high point the land stretched endlessly in shades of green and gold, and the slow-moving river below caught the light like a silver ribbon. Tom felt his heart swell with appreciation for the beauty around him, and Mark said he had never seen anything so peaceful. After resting for a while, Tom and Mark sat near the cabin to share dried fruit and water. Mark hesitated before speaking again, and then he told Tom that news of the old cowboy living alone on the cliff had traveled further than expected. People in nearby towns had heard about his shelter and his strength, and many had expressed admiration for him. Tom felt a gentle surprise at this because he had built his home not for praise but for survival and peace, yet the thought that others respected his effort warmed him. While they talked, the sound of approaching footsteps broke the silence. Tom looked toward the trail and saw 3 figures climbing the ridge. His breath caught slightly because he recognized them, even from a distance. They were his children, the same children who had left him behind and sold the ranch. They climbed slowly, and when they reached the flat ground near the cabin they stopped for a long moment, taking in the sight before them. The stone walls stood strong, the wooden roof looked firm, the lookout tower rose above the cabin like a proud marker of effort and patience. Tom stood still as his children approached, and he felt no anger, only a deep calm that came from acceptance and growth. His eldest child moved forward first and said they had come because they had heard stories about an elderly cowboy who lived alone on the cliff and built wonders with his own hands. They had not believed the stories until they came to see for themselves, and when they saw the shelter they realized it had to be Tom. They looked around in awe because the place looked like something built by a team of workers, not by a single aging man. Tom listened quietly as they spoke. They apologized with honest voices, saying they had not understood how deeply he loved the land, or how strong he still was. They admitted they had been wrong to push him away, and to make decisions without him. They told him they wished they had listened, and asked for forgiveness. Tom stood silently for a long moment, feeling the wind move across his face. He looked at his children, and saw regret in their eyes, but he also saw hope. He spoke to them with a steady voice, saying he did not hold anger toward them. Life changed people, and he understood that. He told them he had found peace on the cliff, and that building this home had healed parts of him that had been wounded for a long time. His children asked if he wanted to return with them. Tom looked at the cabin he had built with his own hands. He looked at the lookout platform. He looked at the valley that had become his friend. Then he shook his head gently, and told them he would stay. This place had become home in a way the ranch no longer was. His children nodded slowly, and said they understood. They offered to visit often, and bring supplies whenever needed, and Tom accepted this with gratitude. He had not expected to see them again, yet here they were standing with respect in their eyes. It felt like a small miracle born from the quiet strength he had found in himself. Mark watched the moment unfold with quiet admiration, because he understood how much courage it took for an old man to rebuild his life, after losing so much. When Tom's children left, they waved one last time before disappearing down the trail. Tom stood at the edge of the ridge for a long while, feeling the warmth of the sun settle across his shoulders. He walked back to the shelter and placed his hand on the wooden door. He felt the strength of the beams and the smoothness of the carved surface. He stepped onto the lookout platform and watched the valley glow in the late afternoon light. Every piece of his new home carried a memory of effort and hope. That evening Tom sat by the small fire outside the cabin and felt a deep sense of completion. The land had welcomed him. He had found friendship. He had rebuilt his spirit, and he had shown his children the strength that still lived inside him. As night settled across the cliff, he leaned back against the stone wall and looked up at the wide sky filled with stars. He felt at peace, he felt whole, and he knew he had built more than a home on this cliff. He had built a new life.